When you think of man versus machine, chances are that game balance isn't the first thing that comes to mind. It's that PvE game mode in TF2 where you can do things like this, and of course, this. Judging from how it's played today, it might seem like MVM was never intended to be anything deeper than a mindless button masher or glorified slot machine. But what if I told you that this wasn't always the case? MVM used to be significantly harder than it is today, not just because the meta hadn't been figured out, and not just because a certain can of gas hadn't been released yet. No, what lowered MVM's difficulty more than anything else was the addition of this button right here. This is the refund button, added to MVM in the Two Cities update of November 2013. Players can click on it before the start of a wave to refund any credits they'd spent on upgrades, not including canteens or buybacks. Sounds innocent enough. This was clearly added to help new players fix their mistakes. What's the harm in that? If that's all this button did, I would not be making this video. The balance implications of refunding in MVM are much deeper than making the game more accessible to newbies. Abusing this button to the fullest essentially allows players to pull thousands of credits that they were never intended to have out of thin air. That might sound confusing. Isn't refunding, by definition, just getting back the money you'd once had? It's complicated, so let's start by going over how MVM was played before refunds were added. When MVM first came out in 2012, there was no way to refund your upgrades. Any upgrades you bought in one wave would persist for the rest of the mission. As such, the difficulty of every MVM mission was purposefully designed around the lack of refunds. Take the advanced mission Disc Deletion for example. Wave 1 pits teams against hordes of pyros alongside 3 giant flare gun pyros. So just get 2 ticks of fire resistance and call it a day, right? Here's the problem with doing that. Yes, spending your credits on fire resistance will make Wave 1 much easier. But after Wave 1, there isn't a single pyro for the rest of the mission. You'll have permanently spent 300 credits just to make Wave 1 easier, at the cost of making the rest of the mission harder. Wave 2 has players primarily fighting groups of huntsman snipers. Let's say you skipped out on getting fire resistance last wave to save some credits and managed to get past it. Maybe now you should get bullet resistance to not get massacred by the 8 huntsman arrows being fired at you? Doing so would certainly make Wave 2 easier, but at the cost of making Wave 3 even harder. Wave 3 introduces hordes of soldiers, who ignore both fire and bullet resists. This wave also includes 6 giant scouts. Defeating giant scouts is a DPS test. Can you deal enough damage to kill them before they run past you and deliver the bomb? This is in direct contrast with the huntsman snipers and pyros from Waves 1 and 2. Killing them is easy, but withstanding their attacks and surviving is not. I could go on, but you get the idea. The difficulty of every mission stems from throwing one threat at you, then giving you an entirely different threat to fight the next wave. You had a decision to make at the start of every wave. Do you spend your credits now to make the current wave easier at the cost of making the rest of the mission harder? Or do you save your credits and make the current wave harder in order to make the future waves easier? Now, let's go through Disc Deletion again, but using infinite refunds. Wave 1, spend 300 credits on fire resistance and beat it easily. Wave 2, refund and spend the regained credits you weren't intended to have on bullet resistance to beat that wave easily. Wave 3, refund and spend those regained credits on DPS and explosive resists to beat that wave easily. Rinse and repeat until the mission is done. There is no tough decision to make anymore. There's no reason not to pick the best upgrades for any particular wave, using a growing surplus of credits that you were intended to earn by braving through earlier waves without upgrades. Why stop at upgrades though? Why not pick the best class with the best upgrades for every single wave? Certain classes in MVM are specialists in that they do exceptionally well against certain threats. For example, Spy is borderline overpowered against giant robots, especially giant medics, which never turn around. However, Spy needs several upgrades to kill giants efficiently. Giants that are infrequent if not entirely absent in the early waves of the mission. Without the use of refunds, this gives a player planning on using Spy 2 options. Play Spy for the entire mission, including the waves where he struggles to accomplish much, or play other classes while buying as few upgrades as possible to save the credits for using Spy later in the mission. Both options make the early wave significantly more difficult in exchange for being able to demolish the giants in the later waves. For example, Wave 5 of the mission Desperation has 4 giant medics paired with 4 giant deflector heavies. This is a massive difficulty spike that often led to teams getting stuck and quitting. Such a difficult wave could be trivialized with a fully upgraded spy, but the aforementioned options for getting to that point were difficult in their own right. When abusing infinite refunds, however, there's no reason not to refund your upgrades and switch to spy on Wave 5. In fact, there's no reason not to do this on every wave. Why not refund and switch to a heavily upgraded sniper on Wave 3 to kill the Fist of Steel heavies and Uber medics single-handedly? Why not refund again and switch to an even more heavily upgraded Pyro on Wave 4 to make the tanks a non-issue? Valve's missions typically focus on just 1 or 2 major threats per wave, whether they be tanks, giants, Uber medics, and so on. Even if you looked up what class and upgrade combination could theoretically trivialize every wave beforehand, it would ordinarily be impossible to do so in practice because there simply aren't enough credits to upgrade multiple classes. Teams needed to plan ahead and designate roles for the entire mission. If some roles were less effective in certain waves, then the rest of the team would need to pick up the slack. This means that the reverse is true. Some roles would be more effective in certain waves, allowing the players within those roles to carry their team to the next wave. Being able to refund infinitely allows players that know what they're doing to play the most effective role for every wave. And if everyone on the team knows how to abuse infinite refunds, then you get games where the bots can't even make it 5 feet past where they spawn, because the team they're up against has tailor-made their upgrades and class composition specifically for that wave. Now, you might be wondering why I keep saying that players are abusing infinite refunds. After all, it's a Valve-endorsed feature, so players should be allowed to use whatever tools are given to them to the fullest. The thing is though, it's not as Valve-endorsed as you might think. I'd said earlier that the refund button was added in the 2 Cities update of 2013. That much was true. However, it did not grant unlimited refunds like it does today. Instead, players would need to earn a refund token once a certain credit threshold had been reached, usually around halfway through the mission. And with that token, players could only refund their credits a single time. So clearly Valve themselves recognized that infinite refunds would undermine the balance of the game mode they'd put so much thought into. Not only that, but they also wished to maintain that original level of difficulty by limiting refunds so severely. If Valve didn't care about MVM's balance, why would they go through the effort of coding the token system when it would be easier to allow refunds whenever? If they didn't care about MVM's balance, why did they nerf several weapons after MVM's release for being too powerful? Why did they go back to fix exploitable oversights like disguised spies being able to body block giants forever? A few classes received some massive buffs, sure, but those buffs weren't given out at random. Valve specifically buffed the classes that were generally frowned upon by the player base. Some of those buffs may have been too much in retrospect, but the point is that leading up to 2 Cities, Valve's balancing philosophy for MVM was surprisingly consistent. They nerfed any weapons or oversights that they deemed too powerful, even if only veteran players knew how to exploit them. Any changes that made the game mode easier were done to make MVM more accessible to newbies, while at least attempting to preserve MVM's high skill ceiling. Possibly the biggest complaint made about MVM around this time was that teams would regularly get stuck mid-mission. If the upgrades they chose weren't enough to get through a certain wave, that was essentially game over. Switching class or even just switching weapons would mean starting from square one without any upgrades. Planning your class choice and upgrade path had always been a key part of playing MVM, a skill that most die-hard MVM players thoroughly enjoyed. But at the same time, that level of coordination and planning was much more than what any new player coming from the base game would expect. In standard TF2, you can pretty much play as whatever you want without getting yelled at. In MVM, coordinating with your team was required to get past the hardest missions. By limiting refunds to once per mission, inexperienced teams were given a second chance to re-coordinate. But MVM's core gameplay of planning and strategizing with your team remained intact. At worst, experienced players could save their token until the end of the mission to refund and counter the very last wave. That was a point of contention for some, but again, this was a calculated decision from Valve. They were willing to lower MVM's skill ceiling a little bit to make the game significantly less punishing to new players. which was a good call in my opinion. So Valve was uncharacteristically competent when it came to balancing MVM. Why am I bringing all of this up? Well, because knowing this makes what happens next all the more frustrating. So, single-use refunds. Some lamented their inclusion, but on the whole, feedback was positive. However, there was a problem. Players had discovered an exploit. After using your refunds token, you could switch to spectator and back to red to get the token back. Essentially, after reaching that credit threshold and gaining a refund token, you could use it an infinite amount of times. This exploit, dubbed the Infinite Refunds exploit, was considered by many to be game-breaking, and for good reason. It let players switch their class and upgrades to counter every single wave after receiving their token, which, like I'd said earlier, was not at all intended. This exploit would continue to be used and abused past 2013, throughout 2014, all the way up until July of 2015, when Valve would finally address it. As of this update, the game-breaking Infinite Refunds exploit was turned into the official feature that we know today. The exploit that undermined all of MVM's balance was now readily available for any player to use. They actually made the exploit even more powerful because it could be done from the very start of the mission without first needing to receive a token. This was a complete departure from the Valve that at least took MVM's balance into consideration just 2 years prior. The legitimization of infinite refunds warped the entire MVM experience in ways that went against how the game mode had originally been designed. Did this mean that every MVM player unanimously hated the exploit turns feature? Not at all. Those that played for the loot loved how infinite refunds let them get to the roulette wheel at the end even faster. Newer players who didn't know how to abuse infinite refunds loved being able to correct their mistakes in real time. Players that were experienced but wanted to mess around loved being able to experiment with non-meta loadouts. These are all totally valid. I'm not trying to argue that anyone who likes the presence of infinite refunds is wrong for feeling that way. Video games are ultimately for fun, and feeling overpowered in MVM is undeniably fun. Messing around with an unconventional loadout and trying to make it work is fun. But to some, it's also fun to be challenged and to overcome that challenge. If Valve was going to add infinite refunds to MVM, the very least they could do is disable them on expert mode. That way, those that played to be challenged could continue being challenged in expert. But Valve didn't do that, and so the skill ceiling for all of MVM was lowered significantly. It would be like if Valve removed rocket jumping and replaced it with a button press a la Overwatch. It would certainly be easier, and some people would appreciate the change, but those that enjoyed the nuance behind rocket jumping and had dumped hundreds of hours into practicing it would understandably get upset. That's exactly how veteran MVM players felt. They were understandably upset by this change. And when the Gas Passer was released 2 years later, the explosion of hatred towards it from those players didn't come out of nowhere. They were already pissed at Valve. The Gas Passer was the straw that broke the camel's back. Am I saying that all MVM players should play exactly how I want them to? No. Am I defending whatever the fuck this is? No. My goal for this video is to add to the overall conversation and to point out that although MVM may seem easy and unbalanced now, it wasn't always that way. Whether that changes the way you view the game mode or not is entirely up to you. But if you're someone who wishes that MVM were a bit more difficult and strategic, try playing without refunds for a change. You might enjoy the added challenge, since after all, it's how MVM was originally designed to be played.